Good afternoon and welcome to the Federal Railroad Administration's Fiscal Year 2022 Consolidated Rail Infrastructure and Safety Improvements Grant Program Notice of Funding Opportunity Office Hours Featured Topics webinar. Before we begin, I would like to take you through the items that you see on your screen. The PowerPoint presentation for the webinar appears in the top left window of your dashboard. If you have problems viewing the presentation slides, ensure that you are not using a web browser to view the webinar. If you are, exit the webinar and re-enter the webinar through the Adobe Connect desktop application. In the troubleshooting notes, or we also call it the troubleshooting tips pod, at the bottom left of your dashboard are some internet, network, video, and audio troubleshooting steps to ensure that participants can both hear and see the presentation. Next to the troubleshooting notes pod is the web links pod. To view the web links, double-click the title of the link. And on the bottom right of the dashboard is the technical support chat pod. And this is where you can ask our support team questions about any technical issues that you're having. Above the technical support chat pod is the Q&A sessions questions pod, which is for the question and answer session. This is where you can ask questions that will be answered during the Q&A portion of today's presentation. Thank you, all of you who submitted pre-webinar questions. Please note that a recording of today's presentation will be uploaded to FRA's website in about a week. The presentation file will be available about 24 hours from now. Before the presentation begins, I'd like to go over the webinar format. We'll start with a brief welcome and then launch into the presentation. Following the presentation portion of the webinar, we will have a question and answer session where FRA will address your pre-webinar questions and the questions that are posted in the Q&A sessions questions pod. And now I would like to hand the presentation over to Miriam.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Miriam Ohamu. I'm from FRA's Rail Program Policy and Evaluation Office. As Mary mentioned, today's office hours will cover the following topics. First, I'll present on an overview of the FY22 CRISI program, followed by a featured topic presented by Michael Johnson on the subject of efficient locomotives. Then Michael will also present on climate initiatives, followed by Melissa Hatcher's presentation on CRISI workforce development. And then finally, we will have a Q&A session. Okay, let's begin. Okay, so FY22 CRISI program overview. This program, or this acronym, stands for Consolidated Rail Infrastructure and Safety Improvements. The purpose of this program is to fund projects that improve the safety, efficiency, and/or reliability of inner-city passenger and freight rail systems. The FRA published a Notice of Funding Opportunity, also known as a NOFO, in the Federal Register on September 2nd, 2022. This makes over $1.4 billion available to fund these sorts of projects. Applications are due by 5 p.m. on December 1st, 2022. There will be no exceptions for late or incomplete applications. So please read the NOFO carefully and follow all of the submission instructions for completing and submitting your application. Okay, next we'll talk about eligible applicants. This comprehensive list here is also in the NOFO, so this lists everyone that's eligible to apply for funding under this program. It includes states, including DC, or groups of states, interstate compacts, public agencies or publicly chartered authorities established by one or more states, a political subdivision of a state, Amtrak or other intercity passenger rail carriers, Class 2 or 3 railroads and associations that represent them, any rail carrier or equipment manufacturer in partnership with at least one state entity, public agency, and or local government, federally recognized Indian tribes, the Transportation Research Board, aka TRB, together with any entity with which it contracts in the development of rail-related research, including cooperative research programs. A university transportation center engaged in rail-related research, and or a nonprofit labor organization representing a class or craft of employees of rail carriers or rail carrier contractors. So that was kind of a long list. Just a quick word about public agencies as described on this slide and in the NOFO. If you are applying as a public agency or publicly chartered authority, please make sure to include a link to your authorizing statute in the project narrative portion of the application, or include it as an attachment, the public charter, if it isn't available online. Since this is a broad category, it makes the intake review process smoother for reviewers if they have direct access to your authorizing statute, and it takes the guesswork out of that. It also speeds up the process, and the smoother the process goes for intake and eligibility review, the better off we all are. Okay, so that covers the eligible applicants. Next, we'll talk about eligible projects. Okay, a wide range of rail capital projects are eligible here, as well as regional or corridor development plans, safety programs, and institutes, and also research and workforce development. Particularly something new in that came out of the bipartisan infrastructure law is a couple of new sorts of projects that are eligible, which include measures that prevent trespassing, preparation of emergency plans for hazardous materials transported by rail, and also rehab or procurement of locomotives, provided that such activities result in the significant reduction of emissions. There is also a 25% set aside for rural projects under this program. And finally, we'll talk about match requirements under this program. So under CRISI 22, the federal share of total costs shall not exceed 80%. 20%, there's a 20% minimum non-federal match for CRISI funded projects, which consist of public sector, so state or local, and or private sector funding. FRA will not consider any federal financial assistance nor any non-federal funds already expended or otherwise encumbered toward the matching requirement unless it's otherwise compliant with 2 CFR Part 200. Applicants must identify the source or sources of their matching funds and other contributions toward the project costs, and clearly and distinctly reflect that those funds as part of the total project costs. And then in-kind contributions, including donation of services, materials, and equipment, may be credited as a project costs in a uniform manner consistent with 2 CFR 200 .306. That concludes my overview section of the CRISI program. Next, I will turn it over to Mike Johnson to present on our first featured topic, efficient locomotives. Mike?
Thank you, Miriam. You can move on to the next slide. So today we're going to talk about one of the new provisions that's in CRISI 2022, and this has to deal with the replacement of locomotives that are more polluting. And we can go on to the next slide. So we're looking at Provision 16. Provision 16 in the FY 2022 CRISI program states that funds from this program can be used for rehabilitating, remanufacturing, procuring, or overhauling locomotives, provided that such activities result in a significant reduction of emissions. So this is a new provision. Under CRISI, you certainly can get funding to purchase locomotives, but this specific provision really aims at trying to reduce emissions from older locomotives. And so I'll define significant reduction of emissions for you in this next slide. I've made this little chart to try to explain this better. So when we got this requirement, the first thing I looked to was the EPA tiering criteria and tried to look for natural breaks that made sense for defining what would be a significant reduction in emissions for a rehabilitated or a replaced locomotive. And this is what we came up with. So to that one large red line, everything to the left of it, the non-tiered, tier 0 and tier 1 locomotives are what we're considering the older and dirtier locomotives that we're looking to get off the rail network. And they can be replaced by everything to the right of that large red line. That second red line that's in between tier 3 and tier 4 also indicates that if you were to purchase a tier 4 locomotive, that could replace anything to the left of that. However, a tier 3 would not necessarily replace a tier 2. So what we're looking at is we can fund out of this provision the rehabilitation or replacement of these non-tiered tier 0, tier 1 locomotives with a tier 2 locomotive or higher. Now, the older locomotives, those older and dirtier ones, must be retrofitted or replaced. Basically, we're looking to remove them from service, and they have to be replaced with a tier 2 locomotive or above. If you were looking to replace a tier 2 or tier 3 locomotive, you would need to purchase or retrofit that locomotive to a tier 4 standard or a zero emissions locomotive, such as a battery electric or hydrogen powered or electrified locomotive. We are considering the use of battery electric and electrified locomotives and hydrogen locomotives as a zero emission opportunity, since our grid is being cleaned up and more energy is being produced renewably. And potentially you could also even purchase that energy from a renewable source if you wanted to. But we'll consider anything that's a battery electric or electrified locomotive as a zero emissions locomotive for the purpose of this conversation and for this particular project. So if you wanted to replace your older locomotives, you potentially could then purchase tier 2 locomotives to replace a non-tiered tier 0 or tier 1 locomotive, but those older locomotives would need to be removed from service. And as part of this process, you'll want to let us know inside your application an estimate what your emissions reductions would be. And of course, we're talking about the EPA criteria emissions. And these would then obviously be the NOx and SOx and the particulate matter. However, as you may note that as you move up the tiering system, you generally also get a much more efficient locomotive. So you're also saving fuel and CO2 emissions, which you may mention as well, and we'll talk about that in just a second. But the main thing to take away from this is with this particular provision in this program, this gives you the opportunity to get a nice match and federal funding for replacing locomotives and removing some of these oldest, dirtiest locomotives out of service. And this kind of fits in with the next thing we're going to talk about in just a minute here. So why don't we move on to the next slide and look at that too. We have to consider climate inequity as per a couple executive orders and initiatives within the department. And I want to explain what this really means in terms of you filling out your grant application and what kind of information you'd want to put into that. So why are we doing this? Executive Order 14008 has a couple sections in it that are pretty particular to our grant programs. One is Section 209. We can't subsidize directly the fossil fuel industry. So for example, we couldn't actually purchase diesel fuel in your grant application this time around because of that. And then Section 213 asks us to consider climate in grant reviews. We also have to consider equity in grant reviews. And what this means is particularly one of the initiatives within the Department of Transportation is that 40% of all DOT grant benefits will need to go to Justice 40 communities. These are generally communities that have been underserved by transportation or negatively impacted by transportation. They're usually lower in the income status and maybe minority communities as well. So let's take a look at what this really means. First thing I want to point out is these are not statutorily requirements for the program. This will not make or break your particular application. However, it could make it more attractive for a reviewer. And I'll tie this in with our prior consideration of Provision 16, where you're replacing some of these older locomotives on the network. You can talk about that not only in terms of the emissions that you would reduce that are EPA criteria pollutants, but also potentially for CO2 benefits from the fuel reduction, and also the equity benefits, because often a lot of these older locomotives are operating in rail yards that are affecting communities around those rail yards that are often Justice 40 communities. So when you're talking about climate and you want to talk about this in terms of your application, some things to think about and things to add into your application would be anything that's going to improve the efficiency of your system or your operations. Obviously, we just talked about that locomotive rehab and replacement program. That's a big one because it can hit both of these categories. If you're reducing fuel use in any of your applications, one handy thing to know is that for every gallon of diesel that you eliminate from that particular program that you're having also eliminates 22.1 pounds of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. So you can look that up on the internet. There's little calculators for you to do that. But adding in potential CO2 estimates is one strategy that you can do to show that you have a net positive impact, that your project will have a net positive impact for climate. Obviously, if you're incorporating any kind of clean energy or alternative energy into your operations, which that can be paid for, that would also provide you benefits. Also, too, if you're expanding your operations, let us know if that is expected to remove traffic or freight from the freight highway or from the road or air modes, because that modal shift due to rail's inherent efficiency will produce benefits for the climate. On the equity side, it's very similar too. We want to look at the benefits that you might provide for safety, for access, and for access to rail facilities, whether it's passenger or freight. Obviously, the fiscal benefits, we always mention those in your BCAs, the benefit cost analysis. So if you're providing fiscal benefits to a particular community that could use it, certainly let us know about that. And this next one's a big one, reducing the air and noise emissions that might impact those communities around, say, a rail yard. Again, I'll use that example of replacing those older locomotives. You'll have a benefit of air pollution reduction around some communities, and you'll want to mention that in your project if that's something that you can identify and document. Essentially, anything that also reduces neighborhood impacts to those particular communities around there that you're working on your project, certainly mention those. And again, finally, obviously involving those communities in transportation decision-making is something that's always looked upon favorably. Just like we'd involve any kind of community, make sure you reach out to all the communities that might be affected. And those are also things that you'll want to mention when you write up your particular grant application. And I think that that's what I have covered for these issues. I know it's a lot of information, but certainly we can handle any questions that come up. I think the next thing is we'll move on to the next area, and that will be Melissa. So Melissa, why don't you take it away?
Thanks, Mike. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Melissa Hatcher, and I'm a project manager in FRA's Office of Regional Outreach and Project Delivery. Workforce development and training programs are a few of the eligible project types under FRA's CRISI grant program, and this eligibility has been underutilized to date, so FRA is looking to change all that with the fiscal year 2022 funds. The ability to create a workforce development and training program under CRISI has the potential to not only help create good paying jobs within the railroad industry, but can also help develop a sustainable talent pipeline. And I'll walk you through an example. As Mariam described, FRA allows a wide range of entities eligible to apply for workforce development projects under the CRISI grant program. These include Class 2 and Class 3 railroads, universities and community colleges, states and public agencies, and Amtrak, just to name a few. Partnerships are also encouraged. And one of those partnerships is between Iowa Northern Railway and the American Short Line and Regional Railroad Association. FRA awarded the partners an approximately $5.4 million CRISI grant in 2020 for the Short Line Training Center project. This grant funds two distinct training programs, an online learning management system providing technical education and training, and a locomotive simulator training program. In addition to funding, FRA's Office of Safety's training specialists are also providing technical assistance developing the training content. With FRA grant funding, Iowa Northern and the association have developed an online platform or learning management system with interactive coursework and assessment materials that are available 24/7. The platform is customized for each participating railroad to provide the course content selected by the railroad for its employee workforce development and to meet its regulatory training requirements. Railroads can assign curriculum, track completion of courses, and track employee progress and performance, all within the system. The online learning management system launched in August, and new material is being added on a regular basis. The second part of the grant is the locomotive simulator training. With CRISI grant funds, Iowa Northern Railway purchased 4 locomotive simulators earlier this year. Simulator training is offered at both Iowa Northern's headquarters in Waterloo, Iowa, or small and regional railroads can arrange to have the simulators brought to their locations. Simulator training is personalized, instructor-led seminars. For more information on the Shoreline Training Center or to ask the project partners questions about their CRISI grant project, please visit the association's Shoreline Training Center website, shown here on the slide. The possibilities within the CRISI grant program, especially as it pertains to the establishment of workforce development and training, are very broad. So essentially what FRA would be looking for is that the program improves or interacts with the railroad safety industry directly. FRA is open to new ideas, so please apply.
Thank you all for joining us today for the fiscal year 2022 Consolidated Rail Infrastructure and Safety Improvements Grant Program Notice of Funding Opportunity Office Hours webinar. Today's webinar will be available on FRA's website in the next week. The webinar will end in 20 seconds. Please copy or screenshot the contact information on the screen. Please note that we will email all web links to you after the webinar.